Welcome, thanks for coming. Today we're going to cover the Azure Cost Estimator. This is a tool CloudJumper provides for our users to estimate the cost of running cloud workspace environments in Azure. We'll run through a couple examples, the first one being a standard 50 user environment running on terminal servers. We'll go through each of the different settings so that you can learn how to do this yourself. This calculator is available at help.cloudjumper.us/ACE, Azure Cost Estimator. Registration is required to get into this page, but is free and doesn't add you to a marketing list of any kind. So there's a few inputs we're going to start with, including the number of users and your RDS user costs, as well as your CWMS user costs. Next, we're going to choose the platform type. When CloudJumper deploys a software-defined data center, there's a couple options you can choose. One of those is to combine all of the roles for the platform, such as our management software, an RDS gateway, an HTML5 gateway, and so on, into a single server. Or those roles can be broken out into multiple servers, or they can be broken out to multiple servers, and we can set up redundant HTML5 and RDS gateways. There's a KB article here that goes into detail about what those mean. For a 50 user environment, we'll just stay with a single server. Next, the FTP server. So when we're deploying an environment in Azure, you can choose whether or not to deploy an FTP server. If it's running in a single server environment, that role of an FTP server will be configured on that same virtual machine. If you've selected multi-server, it will get its own dedicated virtual machine. So when you're doing single server, there is no change to the cost of hosting these environments. The next question you're going to answer is about Active Directory. Are you going to use a single domain controller, double domain controllers, or Azure Active Directory domain services? Again, when you're running a single server and you have a single DC, that role is going to end up on that same server. In this calculator, if you did dual domain controllers, they would each get their own virtual machine in addition to the single server for the platform. And Azure ADDS is effectively a domain controller as a service that is run by Azure. The cost for that's about $110 per month. So depending on the option you choose here, you'll see that it changes your total platform, virtual machines, and Active Directory costs. We're going to go with Azure Active Directory domain services for this account. This calculator optionally allows you to choose if you're going to have public static IP addresses and or VPNs. We'll skip through that because it's not particularly important. Next, we're going to have file servers. So by default, the Cloud Workspace Management Suite deployment will assign the file server role to the first terminal server that gets deployed. We've found that serving files isn't particularly heavy, and we can do that off of a machine that we're already going to be paying for anyway to save some costs without really impacting end user performance. However, if you'd like, this calculator or this estimator allows you to design a dedicated file server that's going to run aside from the terminal servers. So you can make that decision. For a 50 user environment, I'll probably use a single VM for both the first terminal server and for the file server. The difference is only about $40 a month, so we can go either way. The dedicated VM becomes necessary if you're running an environment that is all VDI, which we'll talk about once we get through the first example of an RDS environment. We'll give it a terabyte of storage on, in this case, that first terminal server, and then we'll look at the size of the machine that we want to be running. So for 50 users, we probably are looking at perhaps 2 of the E8s. That would be a pretty robust environment. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, 2 of the E8s. So one of the things that CloudJumper can do is turn terminal servers on and off in response to user sessions. So we'll set a threshold, and one machine will run 24/7. When that threshold of users is reached, the next server will turn on. And if you have more than 2, so on, right? In this case, we've got 50 users and 2 terminal servers, so 25 users per machine is kind of our target. I would say in CWMS we set the target at maybe 15 or 20 users, and once that threshold is set, the second server will turn on. conceptually, if you think about it, when people are working overnight on the weekends, you're not really going to get the critical mass that it takes to turn on that second machine. So the second machine's only going to run during normal kind of working business hours, maybe 6 to 6 every day of the week or something like that. So let's put the amount of time that the environment is active at 60 hours per week. This isn't how much time does the average employee work? It's more a question of what's the average, what's the right word? What's the average active hours for this company? Our calculator is then going to calculate the average uptime between the one machine that's on all the time and the other machine that is on, in this case, less than half of the time. You're then going to have a prorated cost for the compute. So instead of spending $636 times 2, you're spending, what is that, $1,270 something dollars. You're spending $863. So there's a significant 1/3 savings on your compute just by having 2 machines and one of them turning on all the time. We've got the disk in there. We're not going to do any VDI users. We allow you to put in some estimated costs for disk transactions and for network egress. We've observed costs in these ranges, but they do range based on your usage profile. There's some KB articles right here that talk about this to help you kind of figure out and estimate what yours is going to be. You can see we're summarizing here. This is the cost of all the disks that are on all the machines that we've selected here. In this environment, we have 1 machine here and 2 here. So on those 3 machines, this is the total cost of those disks. And this is the estimated cost of backing up those disks. There's a KB article that talks about what we're doing, but there's a lot of assumptions we make here, including the amount of compression, the amount of data that's churning on a daily basis, the amount of time you're going to keep backups, and how often you're going to configure them. So this is probably the least solid number in this whole estimator, and that could vary depending on your use case. Now, the nice thing about it is it's a pretty small number compared to the whole environment, so it's not going to swing the costs too big. So as we've got here, we've got 50 users, a very robust 2-terminal server setup with a total of 16 CPUs, 128 gigs of RAM, and we're coming in at about $40 a user after everything. Spending $1,100 on Azure, another $600 on the CloudJumper licensing, another $300 on RDS. But one of the things we can do with CloudJumper is instead of having just 2 machines with 8 CPUs and 64, we could do 4 of those that are half the size. And what happens with the math is the average uptime will shrink because now we have only 4 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM that are on all the time instead of that other machine that was 864. And then the other 3 are going to be off except for during those 60 hours a week. So we've moved the total cost down to $659, which is almost exactly half of what it would cost to do it without CloudJumper. But we can go even further. So instead of a 432, maybe let's do some 216s, and instead of 4 of them, we can do 8 of them. When you increase the number of machines, you do increase the number of disks, which you don't save when they're turned off. So there is a little bit of an increasing cost on that side, but the compute savings continues to overshadow that. So now we're down to $556 instead of, what were we at, $1,200 and something before? So for $556, we still have the same 16 CPUs, the same 128 gigs of RAM, but we're paying less than half for it. The other thing that happens when you increase the number of terminal servers is there is an increased management cost. So you need to think about the tools you're going to be applying to these machines that might cost you money and see if it's worth expanding from 2 to 4 to 8 and so on. There's some really great automation that's built into CWMS that will help you with applications and updates. And so there are some tools that help mitigate some of those costs of having an additional number of servers, but it's something you want to think about and balance between the savings on the compute side and the costs on kind of the other miscellaneous side. Regardless, we've got this down to about $35 a user with a very robust environment that is deployed in Azure. The other thing we could do, before we get too far, 128 gigs of RAM, so we're at like 2.25 gigs of RAM per user, right? And we've got 16 CPUs, so we're about 3 something users per CPU. The other thing we can do is instead of doing terminal servers, we can do VDI machines. We'll take this down to 0. We got to switch to a file server that's a dedicated VM, just so we don't forget. We were at about $35 before. And then we can come down and turn on the VDI user setting, and let's do 50 of them. What's interesting about the other thing CloudJumper can do is turn off and on machines on a schedule. So we can have them turn on at 8 a.m., off at 5 p.m., on at 6 a.m., off at 10 p.m., whatever you want, which is nice. One of the things that is often a concern is, well, I don't want to turn it off when they're working, or I don't want to have it on whenever they're going to try to work. So one of the things our system does is it intelligently doesn't shut down machines where people are connected until they disconnect. So if it's scheduled to be off at 5 p.m. and a user's still there, the system runs a check that says, am I supposed to be on? And if I'm not, should I shut down? And is there a user connected? And unless they get the right answer for both of those, it doesn't shut down. Once they finally disconnect, it will shut down and start saving you money. Then let's say they want to connect overnight. It's 10 p.m., the kids are in bed, they're done with dinner, they have a little bit more work to do. The system's going to be off and not billing, but CloudJumper has some patent pending technology that when they attempt to log in using their Windows Cloud Workspace client, the system will be triggered to turn that machine back on. It'll give them a notice that says, hey, it's going to take 2 to 5 minutes. We'll connect you through when it's turned on. That 2 to 5 minute delay, that cost, if you will, of user convenience, means that you can be much more aggressive with when you turn these machines off. You can say turn them off at 5, and as soon as they log off, they're going to turn off, right? And you can keep them off until 6 or 7 or 8, whenever they typically start working. So the majority of people, the machine's on when they come in, but if you have early birds, it's going to take them a couple minutes to turn on their machine, just like as if they were turning on a machine in their environment, in the local environment. So we can look at expecting, and because this is a per machine, we can look at expecting that it's a much narrower band. Up here we had 60 hours per week, which is 46.8% of the time. But if we're really thinking the average user is going to be working 40 or 45 hours, we can do 45 times 1, or divided by 168. We're like 26, 27% of the time. So let's change this. 27% of the time, it's up across all the machines. Some people are going to work less, some people will work more. But now we've got our total cost for VDI down to $488. Like I talked about before, the disks are going to increase. So we're going to have 50 of these disks, and so the price on disks has increased significantly right here, right? It was like $50 before. The backup doesn't really change because the machines we're backing up, or the data we're backing up, is the same. We don't really care about backing up 50 identical VDI machines. We can just recreate them anytime we want. And so what we end up with is about $4.50 more per user per month. So it's a little bit more expensive solution to do VDI in this scenario. But if you look at the resources we're giving them 100 CPUs, because there's 50 of them at 2 each, and 200 gigs of RAM, which is 4, 5, 6 times more CPU compute for this environment and almost twice as much RAM. So we're giving this customer a significantly better experience because they've got VDI machines and a significantly increased amount of resources for the cost of about $4 a user. If end user performance is important to you, this is the way to go. These machines can even be running Windows 10, so they have a true workstation level experience in the cloud. The other thing we haven't talked about in here yet is the virtual private servers. So if they have data servers, or they have a database or an app or whatever it is, you can come in here, check the box up here for VPS, switch this down to the number that you have. Now there isn't an actual limit in Azure, we just have a limit in here to keep this form simple. You can choose the size of the machine that you want to be running, whether or not it's going to have SQL, and all the costs are built in along with the size of the disk. So you can add whatever they need here to really build out the true cost of that environment. Finally, you can click the summary report and it will line out all the things you've answered. So we're going to have one B2S for the CW manager, the file server is another B2S. We've got 50 virtual machines that are also B2Ss, and like I said here, no terminal servers. We've got these 2 VPSs, one of them is a E2S, one's a B2, and so on in SQL. And so you can print out this page and you have a good summary of where you're going to end up. Now the last thing we haven't talked about in this whole work through is the decision about self-management versus CloudJumper management. So CloudJumper offers a service where we will do the application installs, we will configure the environment and hand it to you essentially ready for your delivery to your customer. It adds a $25 line item to the cost. As part of that, we also take over the RDS license payment. So it's really about a net $19 increase. And you'll see here that that increases the price by about 19 bucks. It's a great option if you're looking to hand off some of the management. It's also something that you can switch out of later. So if you start with management, you decide you don't want it, you can take it off and take over management yourself. That's the Azure Cost Estimator. I hope it helps you figure out how you're going to deploy your environments. All right, next we're going to take some questions, but I'll go ahead and stop the recording now, and then we can continue this discussion